come 2020, you've got the pandemic and the lockdowns. They're saying this is the liberal tyranny we've been warning about. You've got Black Lives Matter on the streets. There's the police station that's set on fire, and that's the sedition. They're coming. Spontaneously, they came up with the Antifa theory. It came from people's own minds. It didn't need to be handed to them by far-right agitators. And it was a better disaster to deal with than climate change. You can't shoot at climate change. You can't take capitalism to court, right? But this is an enemy that you can take up arms against. We're seeing the build-up of this fascist energies and ideas and emotions. We're seeing the first forays, experimental forays into insurgent right-wing politics. We're seeing people start to redeem and recover fascist iconography and imagery, but it hasn't yet congealed. The danger is that it will. And when it does, it won't look like a dress rehearsal of the 1920s and 30s. It won't be paramilitaries marching in the street with uniforms, because that age is gone. But it will be something very dangerous.
Richard Seymour, welcome to Politics, Joe. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. For people who aren't familiar with you or your work, how would you like to introduce yourself?
So I'm a writer from Northern Ireland, based in London, and I'm a founding editor of Salvage magazine. Been doing this since 2006.
And you've got a book out, Disaster Nationalism, The Downfall of Liberal Civilization, which sounds dramatic, is dramatic. What is disaster nationalism?
Disaster nationalism is a way of talking about a form of far-right nationalism that isn't identical with the kinds of nationalism you get with the SNP or Catalan nationalism, which is fairly benign, civic nationalism by and large. This came to me when I noticed that there was an obsession on the far right with imaginary disasters, with the idea of a white genocide or a great replacement, or elite paedophile rings going from Hollywood to the Democrats, and their fantasies lingering on garish ideas of military violence, coups to get rid of the lefties and the communists and so on. This was conceived actually before the 6th of January insurrection. I was a bit parochial. I was looking at the Brexiteers and I was noticing how fascinated they were with the idea of British decline and downfall. I thought, there's something in that. There's something in everybody that can get excited by chaos and destruction. But this has taken a political turn. And so that was where the idea came from. And I thought that essentially what's going on is that people have been through a lot of disasters in their lives, real disasters, but instead of addressing that, they're being given these imaginary scenarios to get excited about.
Mm. Could you just give a couple of examples of where you see, you mentioned a few there, but where do we see it now in our sort of contemporary political scene?
So we recently, in this country, had race riots, tantamount to pogroms aimed at migrants, people trying to burn down an asylum hotel, people trying to beat up Muslim taxi drivers, a guy got stabbed. In the 6 counties where I come from, Northern Ireland, there was a lot of, there was a racist attack on a mosque and so on. All of this was happening. And you could see that some of what's going on there, it by no means are all these people poor or working class or whatever, but there is an element of that. But one of the things that's going on is that in the long term, people who are drawn to this kind of politics tend to be from layers that are in long-term decline. They've experienced failure in their own lives. They've experienced regional decline, and that has had a toxic emotional effect. And they've been drawn to the idea of a form of politics which, rather than dealing with the complex systemic causes of their problems, which are difficult to deal with and often seem abstract and far away, they've been given something to take arms against, an enemy that they can personify and that can, in principle, be killed. I'll give you a good example. 2020 wildfires in Oregon. These wildfires were caused by climate change. There naturally are wildfires every year on the planet. It's meant to burn. But these wildfires are getting out of control because the planet is heating up. This is not a mystery. But in rural Oregon, they had been told for some time by far-right agitators, YouTube and what have you, that there was a plan by Antifa anti-fascist activists to come and hunt them down, white conservative Christians, and kill them as part of a prelude to a liberal dictatorship, a totalitarian liberal dictatorship. And the fact this doesn't sound like a contradiction in terms should tell you something, but they, like a lot of people believe this, they swallowed this, but importantly, come 2020, you got the pandemic and the lockdowns. They're saying this is the liberal tyranny we've been warning about. You got Black Lives Matter on the streets. There's the police station that's set on fire, and that's the sedition. They're coming. The fires start, and they're saying in these rural areas where there's no news, no local news, they're relying on social media apps. There's too many fires. They're too intense. It's too weird. We've never had anything like this before. Someone is doing this to us. And spontaneously, they came up with the Antifa theory. And they started posting pictures, like pictures of nothing in particular. Like there's a car, and then they would narrate that this car was seen in a local area where 2 people were arrested carrying petrol cans. And they would make up the evidence or contrive the evidence partly from their imaginations. This was spontaneous, bottom-up, apocalyptic fantasy. Donald Trump publicized it. The local sheriff or a local police deputy appeared to give it support. But it came from people's own minds. It didn't need to be handed to them by far-right agitators or whatever. So that's an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. And it was a better disaster to deal with than climate change, because you can't shoot at climate change. You can't take capitalism to court, right? But this is an enemy that you can take up arms against. And there was a guy who was told, you have to leave, you have to get out now, level 3 evacuation order, you're going to die if you stay. And he said he refused, because if I see people doing crap, I'm going to hurt them. That's very animating. And I think we can all sort of understand the emotional appeal of that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's this kind of tendency, inclination, or desire even, to want politics to be firmly based in objective reality, to be the subject of, and actually I think it's probably the tendency of the sort of the density that we have of like economists and lawyers that work within our political system, that you do tend towards the kind of the statistical, the measurable. Mm-hmm. But what you're talking about here is very much, if not emotional, then fantastical, right? You're talking about fantasy. We're talking about the power of myth. We're talking about the power of tragedy. In a way, we're talking about the power of storytelling, and actually, is real evidence of the efficacy and significance of those things in a political climate which increasingly, like I said, is driven more towards objective reality than necessarily emotional reality.
Yeah, I mean, the objectified world that we get from mainstream politicians often doesn't look like the world we inhabit.
Yeah.
An example that occurs to me is back in 2016, Obama was doing a speech making fun of Trump. He said Trump gave this apocalyptic speech, and then the next day the birds were singing, the sun was out. And a few months later, he got his answer. Because a lot of Americans didn't see the birds singing and the sun out. They saw, as Trump put it, American carnage. So the objectified world that tells us everything's good because GDP figures are high, often that doesn't correspond to people's realities. Often locally, high GDP means nothing because you've got deindustrialized wreckage of an area. There's no civic society, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is maybe we should not be too quick to dismiss fantasy as a bad thing. I think any form of politics depends upon an idea of the future, and that horizon is fantastical. Now, we can be as careful and intelligent and scientific about it as we like, but ultimately what we want for the future is something that is rooted in desire and therefore in fantasy. And in our own lives, we do this all the time. I imagine what I want to be doing, when I was 16 years old, I thought I was going to be a professional wrestler or something. Or a famous actor or whatever. Yeah, I know, still time. There really isn't.
That ship has sailed, my friend.
But we make plans, and these plans don't usually come to fruition in the way that we expected. But I also wanted to be a writer, and I became a writer because I had a fantasy about how to do it, and I applied myself, and things worked in a totally different way than I'd imagined, and it's not like I expected. But dreams have a way of coming true just not in the way that people anticipate. And that's the crucial thing about the QAnoners and all the rest of them. They talk about a reality that does not exist. The idea of a global conspiracy by liberal communists, treasonous child abusers and what have you, Satan worshippers, etc., that doesn't exist. However, in presenting that fantasy, they're also projecting a future which they want to see happen, which is a military coup and a dictatorship to keep Donald Trump in power and round up the leftists, have them killed or sent to Guantanamo Bay. That's quite explicit in the QAnon literature. And that would be a big, violent cleansing event. Now, that is a classically fascist fantasy. And there's no reason why that couldn't come true if enough people wanted it to happen. And you saw on 6th of January 2021 a premature attempt to make something like that happen. There were not enough of them. They didn't have sufficient arms. They certainly weren't going to take on the American army. But you see that how desires are formed around fantasies, and they can have real-world effects.
Absolutely. There's a quote here from the book that says, and I'm quoting here, "Disaster nationalism flourishes on the profound unhappiness accumulated in the era of peak liberalism."
Yeah.
Can you expand on what that means and kind of how centrist politics or the politics of the liberal centre, in your view, have failed in the 21st century?
Yeah, I think if you go back to the 1990s, which is when I came of age, and it was New Labour, it was Bill Clinton, it was the third way. And the idea of socialism was out the window. But there was hope because we could move beyond left and right. And the argument then was, as James Carville, running Bill Clinton's election campaign, said, it's the economy, stupid. You make the economy work for enough people, and they will feel secure in their lives and stable. They won't want to go out and persecute anyone. And they'll vote for middle-of-the-road politicians. So make the economy work and everything else will follow. And embedded in that is an idea that what people fundamentally do is they look out for their wallet. They think in terms of their wallet. Funny thing is, of all the evidence that I can find in terms of what motivates people voting, there's almost no evidence for this. Like most of the time, like for example, if you lose your job, or if your factory goes kaput, or if the economy goes into recession and you find yourself losing your mortgage or whatever, the chances that it will change how you think about politics and how you vote are actually fairly slim. Now, that doesn't mean to say that crises in general don't churn people up emotionally and change how they think, but it's not on the basis of personal loss. And it's worth thinking about this because when we come to the Brexit vote, 2016, Liberal centre was outraged and astonished. They couldn't believe it because all the experts had said, this is going to tank the economy. Now, you can have an argument about the extent to which that would happen, and I think it did have a negative effect, but not as much as COVID or other things. But the point was that when people were asked, Brexit voters were asked, what would you be willing to see happen to get Brexit done? Would you be willing to lose your own job? Yes. Most would say yes. Would you be willing to see family member or friend or somebody you know lose their job? Yeah. And then there was a whole series of other things, like these are a lot of them Tory voters. Would you be prepared to see the Conservative Party go under? Yeah. Would you be prepared to lose the union with Northern Ireland? Yeah. This is not traditional conservatism, and it's not certainly not enlightened self-interest. So I think it failed, first of all, in understanding what humans are like. It had a theory of human nature that was wrong. Secondly, it's built on the idea that, as long as the pie is growing, it doesn't matter how big your slice is. Now, that's just not true. All the best evidence we have shows us that what people are attentive to is social comparison. Where do I stand? How validated am I? How recognized am I? Now, you can be told, oh, you're an equal citizen, and we recognize you, we respect you. But if consistently you are given less than everybody else, and you're more likely to get stopped by the police, and you're more likely to end up in jail, you're less likely to get good education, all of this sort of stuff that affects poor people and racialized minorities and what have you, then that recognition doesn't really amount to much. And it's, as I say, emotionally toxic. Now, I think for a long time, neoliberal political economy was sufficiently successful that there was a big enough electoral coalition to keep it in power. And a lot of people were unhappy, but they became politically apathetic. They withdrew from the electoral system. We saw this in our country. 2001 election, there was a huge drop in the number of people voting, and it continued to decline, but more slowly. So people boycotted the system as an act of protest, and that's what the polling suggested it was. But come 2008, the credit crunch, you begin to see something else happen. People start to, first of all, there's a bit of clinging to inertia, right? Vote for the centre to have a safe option, manage the crisis safely. And that's what happened in Britain. It happened in America with Obama. But then you start to see the effects of austerity. You start to see people moving to the radical left and the far right. And the radical left much more weakly, it has to be said. But, there is some polarization. And you also start to see the kind of effects of social breakdown. Like, it's not just what people are voting for. Like, far-right voting had been growing in Europe since, say, 2000, 2001, especially with the war on terror. But it's behaviors like lone wolf murders, lone wolf terrorists emulating Anders Behring Breivik, and going out and killing people, leaving behind a manifesto, and sometimes filming their actions. That starts to spike. Other forms of political violence, riots and what have you, start to soar. So if you're charting the S-curve, which is the classical pattern of a social contagion, it goes along flat for a while, and then it starts to pick up, and then it flattens off again. You would say that in the early 2010s, that's when you start to see the inflection in that curve, things really starting to pick up. And I would say they really misunderstood what was keeping people compliant. It wasn't that they liked or acquiesced in the system particularly. It was a deep sense of despair and pessimism, which gave rise, ultimately, to pathological symptoms. So where there was no, collective alternative. If you're not in a union, if you're not in a political party that can do something for you, if there's no alternative, you can either go into a kind of anomic criminality, just take up violent criminality or addiction or, self-destruction of various kinds. Or there's the option of politicizing on the basis of we should look after our own people first. We should stop looking after all these people coming over here. Why are they coming over here? Why do they get everything first and I don't get anything? And I'm a citizen. I paid into the system all my life. That's, that's one other way in which the Liberal Centre failed. Because they thought if you pander a bit to the anti-immigrant stuff, and New Labour did a fair share of this, and so did the Democrats, but if we pander a bit to this, we'll neutralise it, we'll triangulate, we'll steal the right's lunch, essentially, and everything will be managed and containable. All they did was validate the agenda that was going to come for them, and boy, has it come for them.
Yeah, and you sort of end up, in that specific instance, right, you end up giving salience to an issue that then you either don't have the political will or the capabilities to address, and all of a sudden you foreground this issue that's in the mind of the electorate and you haven't done anything about it.
Yeah.
So is it your view then that disaster nationalism sort of addresses those realities of human nature, wealth inequality, in a way that liberalism failed to do?
It has a certain advantage, and the first advantage I would say is that it doesn't require public passivity. So the neoliberal centre requires us to be passive, withdrawn from politics, not putting democratic demands on the state, because that was one of the reasons for the neoliberal turn in the first place, to relieve the state from some of the demands that were being placed on it. So they want passivity. The far right summons our aggression. It wants us to channel our aggression, and it gives us targets. And that can be very animating, and it can be it can feel empowering. You look at those guys rioting the other week. There was a man standing in the middle of the road holding up traffic. And he said, you can only come through if you're English. So he was both a traffic warden and a customs official, standing there. He had this petty tyrannical power for like 30 seconds. And on a more dark sort of reading of this, there was a scene where they pulled a young, I think, Muslim man out of his car, and there were people shouting, "Kill him, kill him." Now, that's a version of freedom that Trotsky wrote about. He had seen the pogroms in Russia, in Odessa, 1905. The Tsarist regime is cracking down on the 1905 revolution. And what they do is they get some of their anti-Semitic friends, some Cossacks and what have you, to go around murdering people. And you could be a lowly peasant. You could be, as he put it, a trembling slave of hunger and the police. But you could suddenly do anything. Anything was within reach. You could smash a baby's brains out. You could murder an old lady. You could rape somebody. Nobody would stop you. Everything would be justified, all in the name of the Tsar. Well, we don't exactly have that kind of system today, but there is a certain permission that's granted to people in those situations, and it's that selective permissiveness that disaster nationalism gives people. And this is really crucial. It used to be thought that any sign of collective violence would discredit the far right. It would make them look bad, and therefore they wouldn't get elected. We now know from experience, repeated experience, that it energizes them, and it mobilizes their base, and it improves their electoral performance, and it's a kind of unique selling point. Give you two examples of this recently. 2022 general election in Brazil, the presidential election. Lula's 20 points ahead. Bolsonaro's doing very badly because his reign has been not great, just in terms of people's well-being, living standards, and so on. COVID was a factor, but actually living standards were going down beforehand. But yeah, absolutely. So he handles that very badly. But after a summer, a brutal, bloody, violent summer in which there are clashes on the streets, there are Workers' Party supporters getting murdered, there are assaults, regular assaults. Bolsonaro supporters are walking around with guns and flashing them. There's talk of demanding a military coup to save us from communism. After that summer, Bolsonaro came close to winning again. Like, he was within a fraction of a vote, of a percent of the vote. Same thing with Trump. I think really COVID and his mishandling did him in. But that summer of rage, the vigilante violence against Black Lives Matter, preceded by the anti-lockdown protests, armed anti-lockdown protests, and the threats to health officials and all the rest of it. And the insane Republican convention that year, where they made a hero a saint out of Kyle Rittenhouse, who killed 3 people in a protest, and made a big deal of legitimizing suburban vigilante violence. That energized them, and the whole subsequent sequence of them building for a Stop the Steal campaign and trying to stop Biden from being inaugurated is unthinkable without that. I think this really goes back to the Gujarat pogrom in 2002 in India. State of Gujarat, run by Narendra Modi, currently the Prime Minister, far-right Hindu nationalist. There's a fire on a train, and it kills a number of Hindu pilgrims on board. These are from the far-right VHP, I think. And they say, the government, they say Muslims did it. Gangs of local Muslims threw firebombs at the train. And they encourage local people, enabled by the police, helped by the police, and sometimes paid off by businessmen, to go and hunt down and kill Muslims. Lots of them, thousands of them. And they do some brutal things. They, murder babies in front of their mothers. They cut people apart with swords. They jam metal spikes in between women's legs. Desperate, horrifying, ecstatic murders. And then after that, their vote goes up by 5%. They'd been expected to lose the next election because there'd been an earthquake the previous year. Notice the pattern. There's a real disaster. They handle it badly. Then they imagine a fake disaster, Muslim genocide against Hindus. And they organize collective violence. And on the back of that, they campaign. And instead of losing, they increase their vote by 5 percentage points. And the vote goes up most in the areas where there was the most violence. That's the canary in the coal mine. And this has been building for some time.
You write, though, that it isn't actually people like Trump or Bolsonaro or indeed Modi who are the driving force behind this. You write that it's larger forces.
Yeah.
You just give us an overview of what you view those larger forces to be.
So, I mean, I don't want to imply that people like Modi aren't important, but you're right. I went back looking at the history of fascism and how people saw it when it emerged. And on the left, there was a tendency to see it as, oh, this is just the dictatorship of finance capital or imperialist monopoly capital or something like that. You know, a very simple-minded view. But Arthur Rosenberg, who was a member of the Communist Party and then he left, he was a dissident. In 1934, after the Third Reich took power, looked back and he did a detailed study of the rise of the far right. And he said, this has been going on for decades. There's been this ferment of Volkish, racist ideology that's been percolating among millions of people for decades. Otherwise, this could never have happened. In other words, it had to be a mass movement, or as I would say, a social contagion. And a social contagion is, there are all sorts of contagions. Sometimes they're fairly simple, like marketing ideas or memes that get spread on the internet. And, we tend to emulate one another anyway. And the real question is, what's the threshold for the uptake of a particular idea? For a political idea like, fascism or something like that, it's quite high. It takes a lot to push people into supporting that. And the only reason they would do so is if their lives have been wrecked in one way or another, and they're surrounded by other people who encourage them to take that step. And generally speaking, historically, political movements spread regionally rather than, through what's called the small world network, which is basically where people are connected through weak links, but it's very quick to get from one end of the planet to the other, like the internet. They spread through regions and neighborhoods quickly because the threshold is that high for uptake that you actually need lots of people around you to be encouraging you and to give you reasons to participate. This is a bit different. This is something where I think a lot of people's emotional situation has been prepped and primed for many years, decades, I think, really, where they have been encouraged by mass media and politicians to think in terms of migrants being a problem or minorities being a problem or whatever it happens to be. And they have suffered multiple shocks and disasters in their own lives. On top of that, there's the crisis tendencies in any economy. There's the business cycle, as they call it, but I think that's a euphemism. It's actually quite chaotic. There's the tendencies for political systems to break down. There's the stress on the ecological system, which is just going to get worse and worse. You bring all those things together and you see what people are being put through. Those are the kinds of social forces I'm interested in, the emotional effects that it has on people. Because, historically, people on the left would look to things like economic factors. And I do think that's important. Or they would do a political analysis of institutions and why institutions fail. Maybe, depending on what kind of leftist you are, you would look to the international system, imperialism, and there was an argument, for example, that Italy and Germany went to fascism first because they were relatively backward countries who had only recently become major powers in Europe, and they were anxious to get in on the game of colonialism, and they felt held back. And sort of put upon by the rest of Europe. And so this was made them a prime target for fascism to grow. Well, okay, all of that can work. We can argue about the how you define things and so on, how you explain things. But I think the question is, why are people available for these ideas? Why do people who seemed rational and sane yesterday, and many of them had never voted for the right before, this is important, some of them had been on the left, suddenly convert to fascist or far-right ideology? What's going on there? What is the emotional latency that's taking place there? And I think everywhere you look, where these sorts of politics are gaining ground, it's not the case that it's the left behind. That's a bit of a mistake. Or the white working class. That, is a bit of wishful thinking on their part. I really think that it's, if you look at it, it's mostly people who have either experienced personal decline or have experienced being part of a regional decline. And quite often there's a sense in which their personal status and how they're valued and recognized by society is bound up with their being, let's say, in this context, white, male, maybe lower middle class, whatever. Quite often you find people who are, not particularly well off, who work for a living. They're working class, but they get paid a bit better than everybody else in their company because they're relatively secure workers, and the other workers are on casual and precarious contracts. And they regard themselves as being part of an island of wealth that has to be protected against all the moochers and all the migrants and all the people coming in. And there's different sort of experiences that can generate this kind of psychological view. But altogether, there's an idea of, first of all, a feeling that one's position in life is dependent on a certain social distinction, a hierarchy. Whether it's whiteness or masculinity or, being of your nation. There's a certain idea that if I am pushed down into the ranks of ordinary struggling humanity, I lose everything. I'm just one of them. And I don't think anything of them because I've been trained not to. So for decades, neoliberalism has made societies much, much more unequal. And that means the slope that you've got to fall is much steeper. And along with that, there's been this credulous culture of emulating winners. And Donald Trump was one of the biggest sort of icons of that. When he was on The Apprentice, people looked up to him. They wanted to be like him. When he said, "You're fired" on that show, that was libidinal high. You're fired. As if you might not identify with the employee and go, "What, fired? Me?" So there was that. And then on the other side of it, there were television programs, I'm sure you remember this kind of thing in Britain too, stuff about Benefit Street, about people who don't pay their debts and the bailiffs have to come in and kick their doors in. There was a kind of cultural contempt for chavs and all of this sort of stuff. Sadism toward the losers, extolment of the winners. And so if you live in a society like that, and you suddenly experience a failure when you had been doing okay, then I think you're primed for the kind of emotional response that looks for the politics of revenge. And if you look at the perpetrators of the so-called insurrection in January 2021, they actually did some research into this and found that the majority of them were actually not very poor or anything like that. Many of them had been doing extremely well. They'd been business people, some of them were ex-military, but a lot of them had run businesses, had shares and all the rest of it, up until about 2008. And then suddenly, boom, they start losing everything. So you see, people who had previously felt protected from the void of the very bottom of humanity, suddenly feel they're going to lose everything to the third world, to China, and to workers in Asia. They don't like it. So they do have problems. This is important. They do have problems. They do have enemies, in a manner of speaking. You can't say that somebody who has lost everything doesn't have any enemies. The enemy might be impersonal, but they do have enemies. But they are prepared and primed to regard the problem as something that belongs to them being taken away and given to the undeserving poor. the wretched of the earth.
I think there is so often this tendency to understand like movement between classes with this almost quality of the American dream, that it's upwards, right? That it always moves in one direction. But actually what underpins it, I think, is precarity. And quite often, actually, again, when people try to understand class conflict and class war, again, that American dream quality gets projected onto it, that it is from people on lower rungs projecting upward, which doesn't engage with the reality that there's this entire class of people above terrified of dropping below and therefore sabotaging and attacking people who sit beneath them. You mentioned the 1930s there, and you write about the kind of striking similarities between then and now, but I think it's perhaps more illustrative for us to talk about what you view the differences to be when you compare those two time periods.
Crucial differences, and this is why I say it's not yet fascist. First of all, the movements that we see today are not movements out to crush and overthrow democracy and extirpate every last human right or civil liberty. By and large, they take control of electoral democracies and they preserve the system while trying to tilt it in a more authoritarian way. Quite often they try and achieve some sort of constitutional rupture. We saw this in Hungary. We're seeing it in Israel, and Netanyahu's made attempts to do this. And I think this is what Trump would like to achieve, to keep the system of elections, but stack the system in favor of, right-wing authoritarians. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is that they organized forces are not very well developed. You know, they're not at the level of maturity politically in terms of their ideology and in terms of their ability to achieve their objectives that the forces of the fascist right were in 1933-34. They have very poor civic social roots. Apart from India, that's a very different situation. In India, they have a big paramilitary movement, they have big civil society organizations. Something close to genuine fascism is taking place there, although even there they haven't overthrown the democratic system yet. But what we're seeing today is something much more fractured and atomized. People are organized in online networks. When they get engaged in collective violence, it's usually something like, you know, when you get online shitstorms around a particular issue of the day, this is like the armed shitstorm. People find one another. This is what happened during Black Lives Matter when people formed militias overnight. Suddenly there's 15,000 people involved in this militia because they organized on Facebook. Now, they don't have a long history of working with one another or a very deep level of political agreement. They share their prejudices and their willingness to kill. And that's how social media interactions create political contexts. They create kind of hashtagged occasions, rallying points for people to get together. And that's kind of how the far right is organizing today. And then on the other side of that, you get these electoral campaigns, which are basically often celebrity campaigns. They're very personalized. They don't really have a party apparatus behind them or much of a machinery. They have dark money, right? So, and this is really interesting. In the 1930s, I think German business had come round to supporting Hitler. He wouldn't have been their first choice for obvious reasons, but they saw the threat from the communists as serious enough and dangerous enough that they wanted to trust Hitler to smash democracy and stop that from even being possible. We do not see that today. By and large, if you look at where business is donating its political contributions, in America, they swung heavily behind Hillary Clinton in 2016, and again behind Biden in 2020, and now again behind Kamala Harris in 2024. So where's this money coming from? The dark money that I'm referring to. By and large, it's outlying individual members of the capitalist class who have made a lot of money, but they're not really hugely dependent on international flows of capital and money and investment. They don't really care about investing in China. Like, for example, the Koch brothers. who are notorious for funding right-wing causes. I mean, they made their money from oil. They made their money from American investments. They're not that bothered about the World Trade Organization and all the rest of it. I think that's... and if you look at similar patterns, in this country, there were similar groups of capitalists who supported Brexit and funded it. But they didn't represent the majority. The majority really didn't want Brexit to happen because they had strong ties with Europe, and it made no sense for them. So there is this great difference in the level of political cohesion, in the level of ideological clarity, in the level of organization, and in the amount of support they get from the really powerful, the rich. That's the difference. So we are not yet there. We still have space to organize in. And when Trump wins, as I sort of suspect he will tomorrow, it's close enough that I can't be 100% sure about this, but it's leaning in his favor, I think. But when he wins, he's not going to rule as a fascist, right? This is not because he wouldn't like to personally, and it's not because many of his supporters wouldn't like him to, because they don't have the means to, and because to rule as a fascist means you've got to take control of the state apparatuses, and you've got to smash the old liberal representative systems, the division of powers, all the rest of it. Trump, when he got in last time, was immediately surrounded by hostile apparatuses, by the FBI investigation into him. The CIA didn't like him. The State Department didn't like him. The courts didn't like him. He was being hemmed in from all sides. And of course, the media hated him. So he couldn't even achieve what Orban achieved in Hungary, what Modi has achieved in India. So what I would argue is that we are, maybe if you take the analogy back, you could say we're in the maybe 1910s. We're seeing the build-up of this fascist energies and ideas and emotions. We're seeing the first forays, experimental forays into insurgent right-wing politics. We're seeing people start to redeem and recover fascist iconography and imagery, but it hasn't yet congealed. The danger is that it will. And when it does, it won't look like a dress rehearsal of the 1920s and 30s. It won't be paramilitaries marching in the street with uniforms, because that age is gone. But it will be something very dangerous. And I think probably the climate crisis will be the underlying reality propelling this forward, because the more that makes people's lives harder, not just wildfires, floods and storms, but also supply shocks, also, occasional pandemics causing huge credit crunches and financial crashes and so on. Also inflation, because it's going to be more expensive to acquire the goods with which things are made. All of that sort of stuff. And then you have the relative privations that come with adaptation, like changing habits and trying to build a sustainable energy system. You can see a lot of people kicking back against that already. Like, you're not attacking my freedom as a motorist. How dare you? The freedom of the motorist is the sort of iconic essence of capitalist freedom. The freedom of the road. And even though, as Adorno said, you could see it as a form of chains rather than as a form of freedom, nonetheless, people believe in it passionately. And there's a lot of people in Brazil, in the United Kingdom, in America, who've been deeply agitated by the idea of 15-minute cities, by the idea of climate legislation and electric cars. They, I think, have decided, when they're not being just denialist, I think they've decided, you know what, if the planet's going to go, it's going to go. So I'm going to enjoy myself. Let's party like it's 1999, burn it all, drill, baby, drill, and enjoy while we're doing it. And future generations can sort it out.
Yeah, the sort of anti-green agenda has underpinned quite a lot of the AfD's electoral success in Germany, this transition that they were trying to secure and sort of phasing out of boilers and motor cars and stuff. And see the electoral reaction to it has been capitalised on there. You mentioned Trump, and obviously because the election's tomorrow, I would just like to talk about it out of personal interest more than anything else.
Yeah.
It's interesting what you were saying there about how the sort of the apparatus of the state, you could even call it a deep state if you wanted to, basically served to constrain Trump. Whether it was civil servants or sort of traditional Republicans who are sort of anti-MAGA. I can't remember who was speaking to now. It might have been a former chief of staff or someone like that, who basically said the way to deal with him wasn't to tell him no, it was to tell him next week, because by that point he would have forgotten about the issue, that whatever insane thing he was suggesting, and you could move the agenda onto something else. There's a good book, I think it's called Toddler in Chief. It's basically all of his, not all, a lot of his former staff coming out and essentially saying that it was like working with a child. And I think that's what's animated people so intensely around this Project 2025 stuff, which, whether or not you want to project sort of political intention or policy on it, the most worrying aspect of it is that it's essentially they're finding thousands of people to bring into these jobs who are diehard MAGA supporters, who will not offer that level of constraint, that level of leash, I guess, if you like, to sort of rein him in. And that is where people like Kelly, people like Bolton, who are warning and have used the phrase fascist to talk about Trump as a president, past and possibly in future, that he won't have that same level of constraint.
Yeah.
Is that an analysis you agree with? Do you differ? And I would just sort of more generally invite your comments on what a potential second Trump term looks like.
To some extent, I do agree with that. I think that's pretty clear that the MAGA movement, such as it is beginning to build up some momentum within the state, and is changing the Republican Party. Just as importantly, the fact that he is still on top after 6th of January, and then after Roe v. Wade, I think says that this is something that has staying power. Until now, I mean, if you look at some India, for example, Modi was able to take control of and transform the state. The courts became packed with supporters of the BJP, the far-right Hindu Nationalist Party. The media became stuffed with his supporters, and the committees of state that deal with media rules were stuffed with his supporters. Universities and academic panels, again, stuffed with his supporters. Across the board, they colonized the state and took it over. And Trump wasn't able to do that. I would say that to some extent they have been doing that in Israel, and to a greater extent in Hungary. Trump, not so far. I think he personally is a bit too erratic to achieve that kind of thing. I think if he was surrounded by and was able to keep on the kinds of pugilists who really have some strategic idea of what they're doing. He wasn't able to keep Bannon on board. They forced him to get Bannon out, which tells you how weakened he was. But I think this time he could have whoever he wanted, and it would be very hard for them to constrain him in the same way. And all the legal challenges and so on, they haven't worked. There's every chance that he'll end up being faced with a jail sentence. Although if he gets elected, that's sort of, I think a court would be less willing to put him in jail. But even if he were to get locked up, his base would actually love that. They would see that as, they'd be angry, of course, but they would see that as validating their view of the liberal state's endless efforts to fix it and stop. Exactly, martyr him. So, but he would still be able to, and as far as I know, there's no law preventing this. He would still be president. So the president would be in jail. I don't think this is going to happen. I think realistically he will not end up with a prison sentence, even if he's, whatever happens. I think that his supporters in the Republican Party are much more advanced. They have been building up local support in areas where they can, for example, stop certification of electoral results. This has been something they've been building up for some time. It's not like, they just started coming up with that 4 years ago. This has been something the right's been thinking about. So they will have people in strategic positions, whether it's in terms of electoral results, whether it's in terms of the courts. The courts are already overstuffed with right-wing conservative activists, whether it's in terms of the Republican Party. They will be much stronger than they were, but they still will not have the military higher command on board. The military leadership is still loyal to the Republic, okay? And the fact that they said in 2020, if he doesn't go peacefully, we will escort him out. Well, yeah, that's what you would expect them to do. And the fact that they are openly saying, we don't serve a dictator, we don't serve a fascist. I don't have much love for the American military. You know, I mean, I look at Iraq, I look at Afghanistan, I don't think they're my heroes, and I'm not going to lionize them. But it is fair to say that they are not ready to sign up for some sort of dictatorship. So that would be a strong limit on Trump, even if he did want to stage a soft coup like he tried in 2020. So I think what we'd see instead is efforts to pass authoritarian laws and to use executive power to go after, for example, the pro-Palestinian movement would certainly come under the cosh, just as Black Lives Matter would have done. Any leftist movement at all, there'll be an apparatus, machinery of repression wheeled out as much as they can get away with. And I think that they'll be sort of looking for ways to make it much harder to organize politically and to protest, ways to put more people in jail, for example, or make it more likely that if you're engaged in some kind of leftist cause, you can go much more easily to jail, that kind of thing. And I think on another sort of level, I think Trump will have a basis of policymaking already established for him, because when Biden got in, he basically continued many aspects of Trump's governing agenda. So, for example, the China tariffs, he took that trade war to a whole new level. And he took the whole China bashing to a whole new level and made it his own personal specialty. In terms of foreign policy, he accepted Trump's policy in the Middle East, faithfully as it happens, the Abraham Accords, normalization process between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And he was, basically, buddies with Netanyahu. Just as crucially, Trump had promised that he was going to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in infrastructure spending. And he could never do this because the Republican old guard would not allow it. And so that went by the wayside, as did the so-called border wall. There's already plenty of border walls along the southern border anyway. But now he can say, well, my opponent was able to do it. I should be able to do it. And if he wants to invest for any particular reason of his own, to throw money at crony capitalists who support him, to build up some sort of domestic infrastructure system, and dole out a bit of pork barreling, he'll be able to do that much more freely now. So I think elements of Trumpism have been institutionalized within the American state because the Democrats came in and took them up. They had their own agenda, to be sure, and I'm not saying they're the same, but there are certain aspects of Trumpism. The borders agenda has now been fully adopted by the Democratic Party. The agenda on China, the agenda on economic nationalism, and certain aspects of domestic authoritarianism. I don't want to overstate that, but there are certain ways in which protests have been dealt with over the last 4 years have been pretty brutal. So Trump will find the policy space for him, I think, wider than it would have been before. Quite what he wants to do with that, it's not clear. I think to some extent he is an opportunistic politician who rides a wave. And so I think he would be driven by opposition, It would be crushing the opposition that would get him going. And so we would see if there was a mass movement or something, he would be looking to seriously crush it if he could.
There's a really interesting chapter in the book about Andrew Tate, the manosphere, that young men are sort of dialing into, and how it relates to disaster nationalism. And you write about that connection to a kind of to fascism, kind of cuck fantasy. Could you tell me a little bit about that idea and talk specifically about how Tate's rhetoric connects to fascism?
So what we can see is that there is a whole range of fantasies of sexual evil. And one of these fantasies, let's say there's a number of them, but one of them is the idea that young men are persecuted and oppressed by a sexual dictatorship of Chads and Stacys and Tyrants, sexually virile Americans. And as they see it, this is a byproduct of evolutionary history, that women are programmed evolutionarily for what they call hypergamy, to basically mate up the dominance hierarchies, as Jordan Peterson would put it. Basically, the underlying idea is that women like rich men, and they also like men with square jaws and, fairly characteristic ideas of masculinity. And there's an idea that on the softer end of this MRA spectrum, there's an idea you can do something about this by becoming more dominant in your personal skills and by going to the gym and building up your muscle mass, and you can maybe get some plastic surgery on your nose, whatever, right? That's the sort of self-help end of this stuff. It's totally delusional, of course. On the other end of it is the blackpilling, which is essentially there's nothing you can do. You're finished. Because you have been given bad genes and you don't have enough money, and they will never want to mate with you. You're doomed to be lonely for the rest of your life. Now, where do people go with that? One thing is suicide, obviously, and this is a tendentially suicidal movement. But the solution to this sense of despair is assertions of privilege and entitlement. So when people feel lonely and neglected by by the opposite sex, they can respond by saying, well, that's a problem that I need to fix. Maybe I'm doing something to put people off, or maybe it's a social problem. Maybe we're all lonely. Or maybe I don't really want what I think I want. All sorts of questions. There's a number of options. Well, one option is to say, no, I'm entitled, and these women are going to have to, be put back under the thumb. They've had too much freedom, and feminism has been an excuse for them to, to dominate us and to neglect the majority of men. And so there's the idea that if we want the majority of men to be healthy and happy, women have to be taken out of the boardroom. They have to be denied the career advances that they've been getting. They have to stop getting access to higher education, and we need to go back to a more traditional form of life. Now, I don't think that anybody actually really wants that, because nobody's talking about what a traditional form of life really actually consists of. But there's another way of going about it, which is, and this is where Andrew Tate comes in, because what does he say? He went to live in Romania, I think it was, and he said, well, I'm not a rapist. Okay, there's a red flag right there. But I do like to be free. And in Romania, you can rape and, get away with it. Well, when his fans were asked about this, there was a Guardian piece about this, and one of his fans said, I don't care, he can rape who he wants, he's a top G. As if to say, he can rape me if he wants. Because ultimately there's this fateful ambiguity between wanting to be him and wanting to be his victim. The kind of freedom that he's talking about is a horrible, luridly anomic, desperate depressing freedom. It's the freedom of predator and prey. It's no freedom at all. It's constant fear and constant violation. And the crucial thing about the new far right is it's not, as I think Maria Maccocci says of Italian fascism, it's, fascism coming to the relief of the church warden, reestablishing traditional morality. Even interwar fascism didn't quite work like that. But certainly today, it has a transgressive edge. You go on an MRA fora, what do they talk about? They talk about rape and paedophilia. They're obsessed with transgression. They're obsessed with pushing the idea of entitled enjoyment to its limit. And when you look at, who is sexualized in this world, in India, Narendra Modi became a sex figure, a sex symbol after the Gujarat pogrom. I have to take my word for it. There's plenty of accounts from the time. And even today, I think it was the former Miss India, Priya Warwick, who said, he's so wild and sexy, like a lion in that beard of his. This is kind of a common thing, this literal erotic lionization. Trump, suburban moms were polled about him, focus grouped or whatever. What do you think? What would you compare him to? And it was always like a Ferrari or a lion or something like that, something powerful. So you can see what's going on there. There's a sense in which the pussy grabbers and the murderers come with the glamour of transgression, of danger, and that there's something that is, as grim and disgusting as it is, there's something about that can, in certain contexts, for some people, be sexy. I would argue that fundamentally what's going on here, across the board, is that late capitalism is not very sexy. It's kind of boring. Social life has dwindled a bit. I'm just going on the surveys that have been taken of, how are people spending their time, how much dating do they do, how much sex do they have. There's plenty of rigorous survey data on this, and you find it's always declining, and it's been declining for decades, especially among younger generations. And Freud would have said, a life without sexual satisfaction or desire is a life that's not really worth living. And you can see with the incels and the MRAs, do you take their word for it when they say they're involuntarily celibate? Should we take them at their word? Because I think there's an erotophobia going on there. I think the way they talk about women, it's not just the standard way in which, men have, talked down about women and, execrated them, which has always been eroticized in various ways. It's making them as vile and disgusting as possible, so you couldn't possibly want to sleep with them. And then at the same time using them as scapegoats for your lack of desire. I think what's really going on there is that they're not sure whether they want sex, and also that whether it's really about sex. I think what it's about is loneliness and the need for warmth and the need for, and obviously the fact that they need women. This is kind of an important thing. They have a complex, conflicted relationship. They need women. They hate them. Okay, that's not terribly new. Men have been doing that for years, but it's reached a new pitch here. So there's a sense in which they are responding to a crisis in their desire, which is something that's affecting millions of people. And I think that's the dominant form of depression today. Will Davies writes about this in his very good book, Nervous States, about how contemporary depression really registers as paralysis and the collapse of desire. We don't even know what we want anymore. And you certainly can see that politically, and I think that's what's registering in people's personal lives. What do I even want now? This neonate, incipiently fascist politics, not yet fascist, incipiently fascist politics, tries to restore sexual desire by reintroducing prohibitions on one side. We're going to make it illegal to be gay. There'll be no trans people. You're going to have to, have your trad wife taking care of the kids. And on the other hand, you've got the selective permissiveness and liberalization, which is where basically male entitlement goes rampant, can do anything. And it's, I think ultimately this is bound up with the desire to know one's place, right? So it's not just, how can I desire someone sexually in these conditions, but who am I? Where do I fit? And establishing a kind of a phantasmatic dominance hierarchy, and talking about it as if it's rooted in evolutionary history, lobsters and all the rest of it, that offers people a way of stabilizing themselves in a situation where people are really not sure of where they stand anymore. I don't think that problem is particular to the incels and the far right. I think that's a general problem. We just deal with it in different ways.
Richard Seymour, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me.
Thank you for listening.
I really appreciate it. It's been brilliant. As fascinating as the book itself. Questions I wanted to ask you about Israel, but we'll have to come to that another day, because there's enough there to be chewing on. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you so much.